Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me out there. Let me know in the chat. Thanks and welcome everyone for coming to our virtual panel event here hosted by Wavelength, Beyond Bricks and Mortar, How to Preserve Our Venues. My name is Johnny Dovercourt, and I'm the Artistic and Executive Director and one of the co-founders of Wavelength Music Arts Projects. We started out 21 years ago as a collective of artists who wanted to build more support for homegrown music in this area. And we're grateful to have been able to present live music events on these traditional lands since the year 2000. I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging for 15,000 years. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, treaty land that's the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge that this land was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois and Ojibwe confederacies and other nations to share and care for the land and resources around the Great Lakes. And this acknowledgement also asks us what we can do to work towards our own reconciliation with Indigenous people and how we relate to this agreement to be better stewards of the land. And please also take a moment to be mindful of past broken covenants and the need for us all to work for justice and in cooperation and friendship with all people. And while we're reflecting on the need for reconciliation, we're also grateful for the spaces where our community can gather, including all the amazing venues that allow us to host our concert series. And I'd also like to thank our funders and sponsors that make programming like this possible. So a big thank you to Ontario Creates, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, Toronto Arts Council, the Department of Canadian Heritage, Slate Music, TD Bank, ArtsBest, and the SOCAN Foundation. And you can find out more about our organization on the internet at wavelengthmusic.ca. And you heard it here first. Please mark February 18th to 26th, 2022 on your calendars for our upcoming Wavelength Winter Festival. And if you're an artist that wants to play at a Wavelength show, there's never a fee to apply to perform. And you can find the artist submission link at the bottom of our homepage. So without further ado, I'm going to turn into a puff of internet smoke. But before then, it's my pleasure to introduce our host and moderator for this evening. Daniel Rotsztain is the Urban Geographer, an artist, writer, cartographer, and landscape designer whose projects seek to understand and support the diverse settings of the city's public life. He is the co-lead of Plaza Pops, an initiative to transform strip mall parking lots into community gathering spaces, and works with ERA architects on all matters related to heritage. His work has been featured in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and Now magazine. And he also designed the amazing maps that accompany the podcast based on my book, Any Night of the Week. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks so much, Johnny. Such a pleasure to host this conversation and a lot of topics near and dear to my heart and my personal geography in the city. So let's get into it. For those of us who live and breathe the music scene, music venues are our community centers, our cultural incubators, and the vessels for our collective memory. Our venues were at risk before COVID-19, and though many thankfully survived the pandemic, Toronto's cultural spaces remain at risk from gentrification, development pressures, rising expenses, and other threats. This panel is a follow-up to Wavelength's The Future of Music Venues in Toronto panel this past February, held while the province was still in a deep, deep lockdown. This talk will examine ways in which music venues can be preserved as spaces for emerging artists to experiment and advance the culture. The Ontario Heritage Act protects buildings, brick-and-mortar structures, but says little about their uses, the living, breathing spirit of spaces that are created through individuals working together. The Silver Dollar Room, for example, was saved as a physical space, but no one knows if it will return to life as a music venue with an accessible stage for local emerging artists. Really few sound bites to get the conversational juices flowing. So referring to the Silver Dollar Room, Joe Cressy in 2017 said, Like any other venue, the future is uncertain insofar as the landlord could rent the venue to someone with a different vision. The city cannot control the use of the venue, but we have a legal agreement to create a space that is set up to be used for live music. What we've done here is ensure that the silver dollar will live on forever. And then shortly in 2021, in a Now article from September 18th, 2021 by Richard Turpinski, the owner of the condo where the rebuilt silver dollar room is, said he's picturing for an operator a mix between live music, food, cocktails. Someone like a Drake hotel style operator would be great. And meanwhile, a new silver dollar room has opened in the corner of a newly opened comfort zone in Parkdale. So lots of conversational threads to explore. In many ways, this conversation isn't about the iconic landmarks of the city. It's about the everyday spaces, mainstream cultural spaces, but also subcultural DIY and DIT, do it together spaces. It's in those places that their values and their longevity, their everyday spaces, and demolishing them means an irretrievable loss for the city. So while we're using the Silver Dollar Room as a central example, this is not a town hall on the Silver Dollar Room. We're going to see how we can move forward in safeguarding our intangible, what one of our panelists has written extensively about intangible cultural heritage in our cultural spaces. Also recognizing that for-profit spaces are often really important anchor community spaces. And where do we go from here in this conversation? And this is an ongoing conversation. So many people have contributed to this conversation. I'm excited to advance it. The efforts of the Toronto Music Office, the Toronto Music Advisory Council, recent improvements to updating the noise bylaws, Long Winter's recent event exploring DIY strategies for survival, Wavelength's aforementioned February panel. Excited to see the next step. So for everyone attending, we'll be having a Q&A towards the end of the panel around 7 p.m. and ending around 7:30. So if you have questions you want to ask our panelists, please add them to the Q&A box and not the chat box. And though it should go without saying, we will not tolerate any hateful comments or disrespectful language, and any such comments will be removed from the chat. So let's get into it. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. I'll start in the order that they will be speaking. So Dr. Sara Ross is an assistant professor at the Schulich School of Law of Dalhousie University, a former Killam postdoctoral laureate at UBC Law in Vancouver and Banting postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie in Halifax. Her research focuses on the intersection of law, culture, and the city. Her most recent book, which I have the pleasure of having just read, Law and Intangible Cultural Heritage in the City, written during her PhD at Osgoode Hall School of Law, uses Toronto as the main case study and touches on many of the venues that we'll be discussing here today. You can find her on Twitter at Sara_G_Ross. Next, we have Alok Sharma, the manager of tourism services, staff lead for the night economy, and the project manager for Show Love TO for the City of Toronto. Previous to his current roles, he was responsible for the city's music festival, Panamania Live, at Nathan Phillips Square during the Pan Am Games. He was also the music programmer at Harbourfront Center from 2003 to 2010. For years, he DJ'd under the moniker DJ Cola and produced many concerts as an independent promoter. You can find him on Twitter at Alok Sharma TO. And finally, we have Rosina Kazi, the lead singer of the protest electronic duo LAL, who were longlisted for the Polaris Prize in 2019 for their album Dark Beings. They are a queer, gender fluid, non-binary, culturally Muslim and Bengali identified artist. They help run the alternate DIT, Do It Together, community and arts accessible space Unit 2, dedicated to supporting QTS, BIPOC, and friends in order to support an arts ecosystem. Rosina will be releasing a new dance music album in 2022 called Basic Income, co-produced with her music and life partner, Mur. And you can find them at lalforest.com. So let's get into it. I'll invite Sara up to the stage. Hi, Sara. So I think, just to get us all on the same page, and you've done a lot of thinking about in what you call intangible cultural heritage and what I've also heard of as living heritage. So I'm wondering if you could tell us, catch us up on what happened with the Silver Dollar Room and maybe help us understand the difference between cultural heritage and intangible cultural heritage, and what are some of the trickier parts of safeguarding what we might call intangible cultural heritage.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Well, maybe I'll start just a little bit talking about the distinction between tangible cultural heritage and intangible, and the reason why those terms are even relevant. So when we're looking at getting something protected or safeguarded, so a cultural space, a cultural heritage space, usually the main mechanisms that we have available to us, so in Canada, and it's not just Canada, tend to be kind of oriented towards the tangible. And what that means is, traditionally historic spaces. So when we think about, built merit, so is a building iconic for some particular architectural style, or, even maybe a sign or something that's very visually striking and that represents something that has some sort of, deemed architectural historic merit. So that's the tangible. And so that exists, in Canada, that's how most heritage spaces or spaces that we want to protect or safeguard can receive that kind of legal protection that will help them from being removed or replaced or displaced. And so then intangible cultural heritage is something that, at international law, so in the international realm, is a bit more recognized and worked with as a concept than we have in Canada. Not that we don't at all have that in Canada, but just in terms of the actual protection that is available for those kinds of spaces. And so this is, as you said, this kind of idea of a lived heritage is essentially what is, encompassed within this notion of intangible cultural heritage. So it is all those things that, bring meaning to a space. And, a space can be land, it can be within a building, it can be many different things. It's those little bits, that give life meaning and that, we connect to as part of our humanity and all of that stuff. So that's harder to protect, right? So we have a lot of protection that's available for built spaces, but not so much for spaces that, might not have any kind of recognizable, built, tangible merit to protect, but are very important to a community, to groups, to individuals, and so on. And so that's a little bit about what intangible cultural heritage is. And we can see bits of how that's protected when we think about, cultural protections available to, potentially minority groups, to language groups. And that also touches on that intangible aspect. And so, as I said, there tends to be a bit of lacking, availability tools to protect that in spaces, and a lack of recognition that that's something that is important to have legal protection for. And so, that's why we end up with a lot of spaces that are displaced or unable to be protected in certain senses. So the Silver Dollar Room, turning to that part of your question, is an interesting I found to be an interesting case study, because there are actually tools to protect intangible culture within our existing heritage legislation that really only protects tangible spaces. If you can read, and what we do in law is, we don't have necessarily a direct protection for something, but we can read in protections for certain things. And that's essentially what happened with the Silver Dollar Room in a really unique way. So, to kind of catch everyone up on what happened, right? So there was a statement of significance that was written for the Silver Dollar Room, and there was, this advocacy that went into crafting this application to have the Silver Dollar Room protected. So it has, tangible merit that you can actually see in the bylaw that protects it. So, different aspects of the music space, so its walls or its floor or certain items within the building were protected. But what's really interesting about it is it actually, you can actually apply to have something protected for its associative and contextual value, or how it's used in a certain sense. And that actually went into the application for heritage protection for the Silver Dollar Room. And that was part of what, actually helped it achieve that. And so that is, for example, music that was played within its walls, communities that were formed, while listening to, enjoying that music, while performing there, while rehearsing there, those kinds of aspects or activities or uses. So in a sense, even though we can't actually, as the quote you read earlier from about how we can't protect a use of a place to make sure that even if it comes back, it's used for music. There is actually something that was written into it that it has to be maintained for live music and performance. Now, of course, live music performance and those kinds of activities can take on many different shapes. But what is unique is that as opposed to something like Brunswick House that is protected for its actual built space, it's still there. I mean, it's a drugstore. So in that sense, we see Silver Dollar Room is still going to be used for some kind of music, beverages, gathering space for whatever it ends up being. So that's kind of a unique aspect to how it was protected, and maybe what we can work with thinking about how to protect spaces in that. For use in the future, whatever that ends up looking like. But I think those were your kind of central questions, if I got them.
Yeah, and just quickly, just with a couple of minutes you have left, you talk about in your book counter-hegemonic uses of hegemonic legal tools to assert the importance of intangible cultural heritage, living heritage, these spaces. And I'm wondering, we see kind of it 75% there with the Silver Dollar Room. What are some tools that are kind of close by that you think could be a good step forward to getting to that 100% preserving the spirit of a place, or are they there?
Yeah, I think so. This idea of a counter-hegemonic harnessing of hegemonic legal tools or tools in general, reframed in kind of regular speak is taking systems that we have, so legal frameworks that tend to maybe oftentimes protect or provide protection or be used to accomplish kind of hegemonic or dominant cultural aspirations or goals, or dominant cultural spaces, or really any sorts of these aspects. But there is a way of kind of thinking about the language of the law or legal tools or legislation, all of those kinds of things, and use them for other mechanisms. So instead of creating an entirely different framework, entirely new laws or regulations or things like that, there are ways of working within the system we have to kind of, as I mentioned before, read in certain aspects and certain aspects of whether it's human rights or intangible cultural heritage. So this is one example. So the Ontario Regulation 906 and how that plays into heritage protection. So if one were to kind of read in that, associative value and contextual value could include all these aspects of lived heritage, then you can kind of get this intangibility, the importance of these kinds of venues into the kind of more hegemonic framework of heritage legislation we have that currently exists more just for built spaces. And so that's one of the ways. Another way, there are many different aspects of, municipal law and bylaws that can be used. Another example that Toronto's actually done a decent job of kind of looking at and engaging with is the agent of change principle. So for pre-existing venues to be able to kind of maintain themselves in a space rather than being kind of displaced when there are new incoming developments and residences. So that's another existing area with the municipal law or property law that can be used in this counter-hegemonic way. So that's another example.
Thanks so much, Sara. We'll return to those topics as the other panelists weave in and out, and feel free to keep your camera on. And just in case there's ambient noise, turn your mic off. Great. Speaking of the Brunswick House, the Rex all moved out. So if there's anybody who can put together a pitch for maybe that kind of vibe, but maybe a safer space than was there, there's an opportunity. And yeah, I think it's interesting. The Silver Dollar Room is kind of shows to me what happens when you kind of evict a current ecosystem of promoters, bookers, music community, and then they kind of have to find themselves in other places. And I think there's something to be said about, an inevitable process where something's definitely going to change, but then we have to look also at the existing music venues we have right now and how to safeguard those. Thinking about the communities that use them as well. So moving over to Alok, who works with the City of Toronto, and in response to what Sara was saying, I'm wondering if you can describe how the city is moving forward to protect existing cultural spaces or help creating the conditions to support cultural life in Toronto. And specifically, I know you've been working on economic cultural districts, which I know the next panel will get into more fully, so feel free to just give us the preview. But then there was also a recent report on emerging entertainment areas outside of the downtown core, which I recommend to all the audience to check out.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks, Daniel, for the question. There's a couple of programs that are currently active, and then there's other programs that are going to come online in the near future. So I'll probably start with what supports are currently active. And Sara, I'm really glad you brought up the Agent of Change principle. So I'll start there. In 2018, the city approved venue protection measures to support music and entertainment venues that were close to new development applications. So in simple terms, if there is a music venue within 120 meters of a residential development application, city planning will circulate that application to the music office. The music office will review that application, then add additional comments, but they'll also, request a number of assessments to be done. So the applicant will need to do a sound assessment from the location of the development, which is really key. So it's not about doing a sound assessment in front of the establishment. It's actually doing a sound assessment where the development lies. And it would be done with a decibel meter, and it would have to happen while the venue is operating. They will also need to record associated sound to nightlife activity, which is really critical. So it's not just music or any sound that's coming from the venue, but the general nightlife activity and the sound associated with that. And based on the results, the office would then suggest options to the developer, like reorienting the location of the balconies and or using triple glazed windows as an example. One thing that it does do, which is really critical, is that it forces the developer to put an advisory in the purchaser's contract, if it's a condo, let's say, that they are moving into an entertainment area, so that the resident knows that they are moving into a nightlife area when they purchase a unit, and it's not something that they can claim that they didn't know before. In the time that this has started, the music office has reviewed between about 150 to 200 applications. And this is a really a preemptive, proactive conversation with the developers. So that's one thing that's extremely positive. Something else that has been implemented over the past couple of years is the Creative Co-Location Facilities Property Tax. And this is really to help existing venues, but also for venues that are new after a couple of years of existence. So this tax relief mechanism started and was available in 2018, and it was really for qualifying properties acting as creative hubs and creative tenants. And this was really in response to Saving 401 Richmond. In 2019, the criteria was expanded to include membership-based co-working facilities and co-working spaces and enterprises. And this included not-for-profit and for-profit nightlife enterprises like performing arts organizations, festivals and celebrations, and also sound recording facilities. And in 2020, it was expanded to include music venues. So there's several criteria that the music venue would need to meet in order to be considered. I'm not going to go through all of them, but two key ones, which are really important, is that the venue has to operate at least 144 days as a music venue, but they also have to compensate their artists. So that's really critical, that the compensation is key for the performances within that space. In 2020, there was about 48 live music venues. In 2021, there was about 58 live music venues. And we're happy to say that council has made the property tax permanent the creative co-location facilities property tax permanent in 2021. And there is an expectation that as we come out of COVID, that the city will expect more applications in 2022. So that's kind of what's happening now. But there's several initiatives that we've been working on throughout COVID-19, either in response to or work that was being done pre-pandemic. One, which actually came up in front of the executive committee today, was the licensing and zoning review for restaurants, bars, and entertainment venues. So essentially, in recognizing that COVID-19 pandemic had a real negative effect on the entertainment industries, the city is really prioritizing this review of relevant zoning and licensing regulations. And this is really to support businesses while addressing community and public safety issues. A couple of key goals coming out of this is to modernize and clarify licensing categories to help the industry recover from the pandemic, but also to better reflect the operations these businesses across Toronto. So this is about adjust zoning so businesses can better understand and comply with rules regarding what is permitted in each area of the city. And the third point is really to make sure that the licensing aligns with the Toronto music strategy, but also the Toronto's nightlife action plan. And it'll also reflect the concerns expressed by residents, business operators, and business associations. So ultimately here, the goal is to have businesses to be able to operate with less restrictions through having a license that relates to their core business. And hopefully, they no longer have to worry about limiting 6% of their venue space for dancing, as an example. Consultations are going to begin in 2022. And will hopefully happen in April of 2022. But I really encourage everyone to participate to make sure that your concerns and voices are at the table. Next is something that you've talked about, Daniel, which is the Cultural Districts Program. So this is a new initiative, again, that has three key goals. It's really about identifying planning policies to support the development of cultural districts and be of benefit to communities and neighborhoods. So the program is going to focus on strengthening local culture and communities, but also supporting for-profit and not-for-profit small businesses and retail. And they'll also promote community-owned spaces. The third is really working closely with Toronto Indigenous communities to ensure that cultural districts, that the Cultural Districts Program reflects that idea around placemaking, placekeeping, and self-determination priorities that are aligned with the upcoming City of Toronto Reconciliation Action Plan. So through the Cultural Districts Program, there are many opportunities to really strengthen some of the intangible cultural heritage that Sara is talking about. And we know that this intangible cultural heritage exists in every neighborhood across the city. So there are 4 fairly unique culturally distinct spots that are going to be focused on currently, and that's going to be Church and Wellesley, Little Jamaica, Downtown Chinatown, and Geary Avenue. But there'll also be at least one community and or neighborhood in the former city of Etobicoke, North York, or Scarborough. And there'll be broad engagement with local city councillors, community members, stakeholders, neighborhood associations, and BIAs before a final report is produced in 2022. So please look out for that too, because we want to make sure that everyone has their input in that process. And the last thing I'll talk about again, Daniel, is something that we've done this past year, and that's around the emerging entertainment areas outside of the downtown core. So it's a report that was recently adopted by Economic Community Development Committee, excuse me. And one of the key elements is that I think is important for us to discuss is that Toronto Building in partnership with Toronto Fire Services are going to hire a third-party code consultant to kind of look at the current building code to see if dual use and or temporary use of venues could exist within a business and or within a space. And so this is really exciting because depending on what the outcome is, we can hopefully have a template of what a DIY organizer might need to do in order to utilize this space both within the downtown core, but outside of the downtown core. So it's really exciting that Toronto Building is taking on this initiative. The report is also going to promote areas outside of the city. And so there's a lot of areas outside of the city that are already currently zoned for entertainment use. And we're going to be promoting that to the industry and to the community, because we also know that there's a lot of opportunity for new businesses, both either restaurants and or live music venues to open up in zoned areas outside of the downtown core. And lastly, the city is going to also create a central source of information for DIY events organizers. And this information is going to be featured on the city's music page, but it'll also be on the night economy page as well.
Wow. So many projects, so many initiatives. And they all, I mean, one of the fundamental things is, the context that we're in is this kind of development, the ground beneath our feet is kind of precarious, and is, a lot of cultural operators are contending with, a precarity of space. And you spoke about the emerging entertainment areas outside of the downtown core. And I just want to clarify, and we talked about this before, but that's more about, temporary uses than it is about kind of safeguarding long-term venues, or what's the distinction there? What's the strategies there?
Yeah, the strategy there is temporary use for sure. So for DIY event organizers that want to look at space outside of the city, but it's also for brick and mortar, for new space to be developed. Yeah,
and slightly related, one thing that was interesting about the case of the Silver Dollar Room, and just the way that people kind of thought about its future, was that the comfort zone was like completely left out of the conversation, as Sara pointed out in her book. And just wondering how the city ensures that, these subculture spaces that are just as important, but maybe don't appear during the daytime hours, or as Sara says in her book, are invisible kind of users. What are ways the city is going to make sure to include voices that are not often included in the mainstream narratives of what constitutes culture?
Well, I'm hoping that's something that the cultural district report will end up doing. I think that'll be a really good foundation for the future, to ensure that some of those subculture spots are actually not only seen as relevant, but are part of the process of maintaining for future use. The interesting thing about the Silver Dollar is I know a colleague of mine worked very closely with the developer Fitzrovia, and they were able to obviously get the Silver Dollar space still a part of the overall building. They got agreement that it'll be used as a music venue, but they also connected the developer with many different promoters across the city. But because of obviously the lease costs and the size of the room, the economics wasn't necessarily there for a promoter, or at least one music promoter, to take it on. And so that is a bit of a challenge that we certainly need to look at in the future.
Yeah, well, just like the models are exploring outside the downtown core, new models of co-ownership, co-producing, lighter foot in terms of inhabiting permanent space. It's a conversation that I keep having with people about what are pragmatic ways that cultural creators can survive in the city, and one of the ways is sharing resources and such. So looking forward to seeing how those land, and how the panelists respond to some of the projects that you have shared. So thank you so much. Feel free to leave your camera on and join us on stage. And Rose, I'll call you up to the platform here. Alok talked a lot about, great background, gotta be said.
I'm trying to change it.
Alok talked a lot about, city processes and, what they're trying to do to accommodate, cultural creators. It has to be said that you've been at Unit 2 for 13 years, and that's like incredible longevity in this town. And I'm wondering, without spilling all the beans, like what are your strategies for survival and how can the city support that? Or, from what Alok was saying, did anything catch your fancy, or did anything ignite like, oh, maybe that would actually help us out? Or what was your reaction to all that?
I think my first reaction was, why don't I know the fuck about these things? And I know Alok, right? And it's interesting to me because most of the people that in the city, I think people have to understand, and Alok, just tell me if I'm wrong, there's two parts to the city. The way that I see it, there's the entertainment side, the arts side, and then there's like the kind of, public, political side. And so because of the work that we do at Unit 2, like we're not just housing artists and trying to support artists and ourselves, we're also making sure that people are taken care of. Like often we are called to house people, to feed people. We've housed a lot of trans women of color over the last 2 years. So, at Unit 2 at our home. And so what bothers me with the city and what's difficult for me with the city is that many times our communities, whether we're racialized, queer, trans, two-spirit, if we're outside the margins, the city does not support us from an artistic perspective, but also from a political perspective. And so before I even sort of go in, which is interesting, I just put in the chat, like I just helped creatively create 5 films for the Luminato Festival, talking about music, culture, and venues in the city. But Luminato wanted me to do, let's look at all the venues that are being displaced or have been taken away. And I was like, that's cool. But I'm going to also talk to you about the fact that many of our communities have not had access to power. So I'm going to highlight communities of color. I'm going to highlight queer and trans artists. So these are 5 films. I'm not a fucking filmmaker, but all of a sudden I'm making films with a great team of people looking at the different scenes, punk, looking at hip hop, looking at, you can check them out. I haven't even watched them completely properly. So those things will let you know about where we're coming from. It surprises me that I've heard about the city and I know that things are happening, and I'm glad that we're reacquainting after so long. But honestly, I don't have the time as a working full-time artist, as a community, as a community person, as a person who's helped run Unit 2 and been organizing folks, dealing with safety. Like that's our main thing. Our main thing isn't about being part of the industry and an economic standpoint. Our whole thing is how do we create an ecosystem, and how do we make sure that people in our ecosystem can have an arts career, know how to navigate that, can survive, can deal with mental health, can deal with housing, can deal with food issues, food security. So we look at the whole picture. And I think often we're not invited by the city, apart from women of color or queers who work at the city, because our main objective isn't just to be famous and, hey, look at us. Our objective is to create an ecosystem, because as young people growing up in Toronto, we were never to a certain extent embraced, so that's kind of where we come from. And so I'm glad that Alok is talking about these things, but it's very hard for us as a DIY community, I call it DIT, do it together, to go through all the bureaucratic steps that the city puts in front of us, because we're too busy making sure our friends are alive.
Oh, we lost your sound. Rose. Rose. Can panelists hear me? Sorry. Okay, so Rose, we lost you a minute ago. I thought it was maybe just me. I'm wondering what's happening. Okay. Okay, maybe we can hear you. Let's try.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Okay. Sorry to
Blab, no one heard that.
just for the last minutes. I panicked because I couldn't hear you. Does anyone know where we lost Rose? You were saying that you're taking care of people, you're making sure that they're alive, and you don't have the time for city bureaucratic processes.
Okay, so you got, I think you got most of it.
Yeah.
But it just makes it, but yeah, the last thing I'll just say, it's as, people co-opt these ideas from the underground around care, around, even land acknowledgements. It's like, we're not co-opting that shit. That's who we are as a community. We take the time to make sure that we build real relationships. And so I think that's why we're often not, people don't connect with us because we don't promote, like we're not letting the city know what we're doing, because part of what we're doing, technically, we're not supposed to be doing. Mind you, we've done most of our things legally and we're good and we have good people to support us. But like, we actually don't want a lot of people to know what we're doing because we're a small space. And often the small is not recognized as culturally important. And it is, I think, where it starts off in the small. It must start off in the small in order for it to grow. And often I find that the industry waits for it to grow and then jumps on, where our whole thing is like, no, we want to build this shit together. We want to pull up, but we want to make sure everyone can be a part of it, and not just pick from when they've made it. And then when artists or when organized artists, particularly when they're going through mental health shit or they're falling, half that industry disappears. We're the bitches who show up to make sure you have a home, that you have rent covered, that you got food. And so that's what we continually have been doing. And that's where I think the shift needs to happen, in terms of we need to look at this as care and not just economy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, it gets to why it's so much easier to preserve a building. A building does not have feelings. You don't have to feed a building. You do have to make sure the heating is working and all that. But a building doesn't, rally against the conditions of capitalism and, labor and, protecting labor. Like, the meat here is that it's harder to protect intangible cultural heritage because it is it is us and it is alive. And I think like Unit 2's like beautiful history shows that these spaces aren't just about live music and staying out late and all the illicit things. It's actually about taking care of community members and, making space for them. And, your longevity is kind of unheard of in the city for a space. And you probably owe that to just, you're smart and you've stayed small and you don't advertise. But, I'm wondering, like, for people who aren't Unit 2, who are maybe in a similar position, how do they interface with kind of the precarity that's inherent in the city, or how do they get around that or get ahead of that, or not let that define, their cultural activities or undermine their care? Where's the hope?
Well, I think we talked about this before, but not in this talk, but previous. But I come from the Bangladeshi community. So my parents were involved with folks who immigrated in the late 60s and the 70s. And in order to culturally survive, in order to even just, a mental health wise survive, to find community, they started the first Bangladeshi Association. So I've played in every high school in Toronto. At OCAD, my aunt used to teach their classical Indian dance, and we used to, be at OCAD. So I was raised to take up space. There's basement parties were a huge thing in my community. They still are. Some of the most amazing musicians play in basements in houses all over Mississauga, Brampton, Scarborough. So that's what I grew up around. And I think that's what many of us who come from different, communities have grown up around. We were never really welcomed. Like, even in a Canadian context, the Bangladeshi community isn't necessarily welcomed in a way that it should be, especially because of Bangladeshi's ability to be artistic and creative and critical. There's so much cultural heritage there. So I think for so many of us who are also queer and trans or two-spirit, non-binary, oftentimes we're never part of the conversation, whether it be revolution or whether it be whatever power. We're usually the ones who are kicked out, right? Or asked to leave. So my whole thing is like, we're just going to build something over here. I'm not interested in dismantling the powers that be anymore, because the powers that be, and there is allyship and there is friendship among those powers, but dismantling it is a waste of my time. What I want to spend my time is building something new. And that's what many of us have been doing before COVID even started. So when COVID hit, it was just another, oops, okay, here we go again. We got to change again. And so I think that's where the hope is. It's in our basements, it's in our backyards. And obviously we want to be mindful of our neighbors. It's building relationships with our neighbors, with the community around. So I think it is possible. It's just for late time stuff, that's where it becomes difficult, because there's a bad stigma when it comes to like late club culture. And it's unfortunate because I grew up in club culture where people actually looked out for each other. And I think that it depends on the promoter, it depends on the party, it depends on the community. But I come from a culture of electronic music that actually does give a fuck. And I think those are the people that the city needs to talk to, not just the ones who do well for a moment and then talk about safety, but don't actually implement it. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I have to be hopeful, because if I'm not, I will die. And I also have a friend who said, it's not even about hope. Like, fuck hope. We just have to do it to survive, right? We just do it. I like being hopeful because it's, but at the same time, it's like, no, we're just going to do it because we have to.
Yeah. And yeah, two strands. And I'll put it to Alok and Sara for, maybe free form commenting before maybe I put a shape on the conversation. Do you have any responses, either of you?
Sure, I can jump in. There's a lot of great points that Rose has brought up. And I think when it comes to who we speak to, that's something really critical. Like, often when we do consultations and we're speaking to people, we tend to go to the same people, and that's just maybe habitual. That's who responds the most. But I do think that in the future, as we build out these consultations for the programs that I had spoken about, it will be critical for us to be able to promote that in a different way and to get it out to people that have different experiences. So it's not, and I'm not saying we haven't done this in the past, but yeah, so it's not just the kingpin of electronic music, if you want to use that terminology now, but those that have been doing it for a long time. So I think it's very important for us to look at past, present, and future when we look at these things. And there's a lot of history there that often we don't get to hear. And that is something that we will be looking at going forward when we do seek out consultations, is to kind of make sure that, as Sara puts it, that we understand that intangible heritage culture and the history of that intangible heritage culture.
Sara, go ahead, and then I'll see if there are any threads to pick up before we go to the audience.
Yeah, I just to say, this theme of kind of who's at the table, right? Who's speaking in order to have different decisions made, or different, programs or organized or anything like that. And, and I think it's a very complicated thing to work through, how to get everyone in the room and get people at the table. And it's not just necessarily about, talking to beyond the kind of regular usual players, but also thinking beyond, different norms, spatiotemporal norms of who's consulted. And also understanding that, there's additional labor involved in consulting with different groups, right? So it's hard not only to get everyone to the table, but also to kind of realize that there's a lot that goes into them having the time to be there and them wanting to be there. So everyone kind of needing to navigate that to get everyone there is something that I think is a constant work in process that has to be, always refined. And that's something that I think is just a work in progress always for cities from what I've seen.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just mention something? And what I often ask myself when I'm asked to go to things is, I ask myself, who's not at this table? and as also artists and communities who are looking at accessibility, we work with deaf communities, differently abled, like often, like we're not at the table. So I think that's actually a very important question is who's not here, because those are the folks we have to invite as well.
Yeah, and I think, what we're kind of sketching out together is there's like that spectrum of places that we need to put the pressure and take off the pressure. And as Sara was saying, using the tools the formal tools, there are actually ways we can subvert them or twist them or use them differently to accomplish goals. But that is, has limits in a certain realm. And then there's Alok's, multiple city programs, which then get to a place. And then I'm just thinking, with the chaos of a city, and I think it's an unspoken thread in a lot of these conversations is where does the city get out of the way, right? As opposed to, get in the way. And I think we shouldn't talk about it that much because that's the secret sauce that keeps the communities going. And not everything has to be formalized. But I think what does have to happen is that people feel safe to live in the city, and that has to do with economics. It has to do with sense of belonging and welcoming a sense of a future. So as long as those things are grounded, and there are all these multiple places in the conversation, I think the panelists we have here represent like the whole wide spectrum. So I just wish you all, to continue in your work and, fighting for a life here, because it's super important in all the different ways you've described. Perhaps we can go to some questions from the audience. So I have a secret screen in front of me. So there's a question about from Paul Ramirez about music rehearsal spaces in the city. The Rehearsal Factory, the largest provider of rehearsal spaces in Ontario, is in the process of closing and selling all of its locations, which will affect roughly 400 rehearsal spaces in Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area. The Richmond location has already closed. The Front Street and Mississauga locations are set to close next week, and in the new year, the spaces on Geary will be affected by the purchase of the C3 Church. Without live music rehearsal spaces in the city, local talent will be forced to relocate to work on their art. Live music rehearsal spaces are an integral part of the nighttime economy in the city. It's integral to professional and hobby musicians. So there's no question there, but I guess there's the, alerting that it's not just venues, it's the infrastructure. And I know Unit 2 is, Rose, maybe you could talk about Unit 2 and how you've been using it through the pandemic, or, how you use it not just as a venue.
Sure. Do you want me to answer that now?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, over the pandemic, a lot of what we were doing was care work. So, as soon as COVID hit, we did food. We raised money, we collected food, and we got on the streets and we started getting food to people. So, a lot of what we've been doing is mental health support and less having events, because obviously we can't do that. Moving forward, we've just put in a 3-camera system, lights, to keep things to exactly for that, for rehearsals, for online events. We're not interested right now in doing public events. We're still a bit nervous, particularly because we are a small space. And as musicians who, get to rehearse in our space, we know that the shutdown of rehearsal spaces is massive. So that's part of what we're doing. We're gearing it towards queer, trans, racialized folks, mostly and accessible. So we're trying to make it free for those folks as much as possible. We're not quite there yet, but that's what we're gearing up for. And then the hope is that we'll return to, and we want to be very careful with COVID stuff. So we're just keeping things small and within the community. So it's a lot of rehearsal. It's a lot of stuff like meetings, small community dinners, stuff like that. I don't know what's going to happen. We do throw stuff outside. We did get away with it over the summer, mostly because we don't get in trouble for sound. I hope that we can work with the city. We've had multiple promoters ask us to do stuff in front of Unit 2 because we have the ability, but to negotiate between our landlord and also the city just makes it really difficult. So if we had the city on side, it is possible. But because Sterling is gentrifying in a way that also feels sort of weird, we've got the Mocha's there. We've got, the beer people are there, Henderson's, but they don't really talk to us either. Like we just started talking to the Mocha because of issues of equity that we tried to raise on our own street. So as soon as you become that critical voice, or as soon as you're like, I just don't want to fuck with you because you can give me beer or money, there often isn't an interest. Because again, we're not part of the upper echelon, but slowly as people get to recognize how long we've been in this city and our reputation, then you start to see a bit of a different perspective, or people treat us then differently. But for me, it's like I was taught by the Indigenous folks on this territory, at least in Ontario, my friends, like you build relationships. If we're going to honor these treaties, dish with one spoon, it's not just with us and Indigenous folks, it's with all of us. And often we don't do that. So if we're not even going to introduce ourselves as neighbors on a street that we've been on for 13 years, when we got there first, and when we've been to all these spaces, right? So I think that's part of it. It's like relationship building is really important, and not just a surface relationship building, like friendship. So,
and yeah, that really goes with Sara talking a lot about like including people in the conversation, and there needs to be like a societal incentive beyond capital to get to know each other, which should just be basic principles. But you're kind of pointing to the way your ecosystem works on Sterling Road is about relationships, and sometimes it doesn't work and sometimes it does. Alok, is there anything city side on rehearsal space? With the closure of the rehearsal factory, they were unique in their provision on a city scale, and but their buildings are on these development rich sites, and it seems inevitable that a place like that will cash it in or move on. So what can we do, or what's being done about that kind of infrastructure?
Well, I wish I had a silver bullet answer to this.
You don't?
But it's no, I don't. But it's certainly something that is top of mind and being discussed both within the music office and with the Toronto Music Advisory Committee, and then also within Night Economy. So we have both an external and internal working group, and this is one of the topics that we're going to be looking at in January. Is kind of what can be done, because we need to retain spaces like rehearsal space across the city, and it is tough, right? Because we live in a society that currently deems space as a development space. And there are certain things that we need to understand too, is that there's a lot of things that we as a city, or myself as an individual working at the city, would love to do, but we're also a creature of the province. And so our hands, there's been a lot of great decisions that council has made to protect sites, heritage sites, music venues, etc. But it goes to OMB, and the province turns it upside down and votes on the side of the developer. So, not to say that we won't continue trying. I think those discussions need to happen, but we're limited in terms of what we can do. And I think we need to. We've done some good things, and we need to continue to do better and do more things to protect the cultural heritage of our city, but we are a creature of the province.
Yeah, just thought that occurred to me now is we have community centers with pools and athletic facilities. Why not, rehearsal space is embedded in the infrastructure of what's available through city services. And I know that there's like artscapes and such, and those are partnerships with the city often, but just a little creative thought for
sure. No, I think that's a great thought. And I'd encourage anybody who's listening to this panel that, if you have some really good creative ideas that you want to propose, please send it my way, and send it either to myself. You can send it to Mike Tanner, or you can send it to others in the city, if you have other contacts in the city, because it's really important that we kind of hear from the community on what the best approach is as well. We want is a city determining this will save rehearsal space. It's really about that kind of collaboration and communication that needs to happen with those on the ground that are that utilize these spaces in order for us to make the right decision.
I can attest to the fact that the city is more porous than it seems, other than the fact that the province can just delete it if it wanted to. But if anybody else in the audience wants to reach out and strategize about, how to interface, because there's lots of good folk trying to do, doing their best, and it is about us as citizens kind of bringing those ideas forward. So thanks for that inspo, Alok. From an anonymous attendee, Dr. Ross mentioned that the Ontario Heritage Act allows for the designation and protection of properties for their historic contextual associative value. Aside from the silver dollar, are there any other examples in Ontario or otherwise of protection of properties that have been protected for their connection to modern, in quotes, culture or still evolving communities? Are there any examples that are exciting or promising for members of those communities?
Yeah,
is this the silver bullet that we're looking for?
Well, I mean, as with everything to do with heritage designation, right? It takes people to craft and go after getting a heritage designation, right? So there's a lot of work that goes into that. As for other spaces, that are potentially protected for that, I mean, I'm quite certain that that Ontario Regulation 906 has been used, to kind of buttress other aspects of a heritage designation. So, we could go through and look at all the different bylaws that, have potentially listed that addition of the associative and contextual value. But, it is quite rare to see it, and I'm not aware of any others that an actual music or cultural space that it is just protected for its intangible merit. And keep in mind, right, that the tangible aspects of the silver dollar room was still the hook that got its protection. So there was also, of course, the contextual and associative value, but that wasn't the main thing that got the protection for the silver dollar room. So no, I think it's still a work in progress, but it is something that I think could be harnessed. There are other different parts of heritage protection that could potentially be used as well. So I think there is hope within that, but there's still a lot of labor, right? So people have to come together and think about using heritage legislation, think about using that regulation to kind of have these spaces protected. So there's hope in that, I think.
What's interesting is, in the kind of colonial Canadian context, often when we capital H heritage is, of a certain vintage, and actually safeguarding it is the symbolic of harm to Indigenous communities, because, it represents certain things. And in many ways, like the decolonization conversation is the same as this intangible heritage conversation, because it's about lifeways, it's about practices. It's not about inert matter. It's about relationships. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity, as we get toward a decolonizing framework and working toward that intangible cultural heritage and living heritage is a part of that. And everyone would benefit from an assertion of, practices and processes and community, as taking as much weight as currently bricks and mortar do. So I think, hopefully we're getting into that direction, and I know that there's a lot of work of the city being done and on the ground. So that's interesting. And I know, I went to Tokyo, and there it's very interesting because there you see these ancient temples, but they're actually rebuilt every 8 years, and they're actually newer than a lot of the modern buildings. But it's in the rebuilding of those buildings that the cultural heritage is maintained, because you have to remember how to build them, and you have to remember the processes. And so it's not about the brick, it's about the relationship to it and the processes. So I think it is like we're caught in a philosophical context, and of course we can't just step right out of it, but as long as we're aware of it and having these conversations, I think we can go to healthier places. Any comments on that from other panelists?
I will say what I find really fascinating is that the elephant in the room is that artists are struggling in the city, like as musicians especially too, and then certain kinds of music then even get even more sort of shit on. But as artists, like we are struggling with housing, we are struggling with mental health, we are struggling with whether you're professional or not. We're struggling with food, having food on our table. And so I think the reason why it's difficult for us to work with the city, particularly Unit 2, is because even though Alok, and I know there's a part of the city that has no control of this, and also like because of politics in general, but like the city isn't taking care of housing for trans folks, trans women, trans folks of color, food for a lot of the people that I know, like friends of mine. And so then it makes it really difficult. It's not that we won't have a conversation with the city, but when the most precarious people in our community are the most precarious in the city, and the city is not stepping up to make sure that those things, our communities are supported, it really makes it hard just to separate out, because my life isn't just art and then here's my life. It's the whole thing. I'm a whole being, and same with the community that I'm a part of. And that's what makes it tricky with the city. Even, our counselor is supposed to be the head of, I think, the head of the committee for accessible housing. Yet so many people have stayed at our house, and I've reached out to them, and we've had a meeting, but the meeting was, well, why don't you do all of this? And why don't you provide all this work? And I'm like, bitch, we're cooking food and housing people. We don't have time to do that. So something needs to shift so that the city allows the bureaucracy needs to change so that, us as artists can actually live and thrive in this city. Like, it's not that I don't need a venue. Of course I need a venue. Of course I need rehearsal space. But if I can't pay my rent, if I can't eat, music isn't going to save my life. You know what I mean? So we have to look at it holistically. And I don't think often we are as a community in Toronto.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like heritage is an expression of the whole thing. And I know that like there's a lot of distrust with other city divisions that aren't in economic development, but the city is a whole entity. And when we see violent encampment and clearings, we're kind of, that's making every part of us less able to kind of trust and be willing with the process.
And violent encampments, like money spent to hire black and brown bodies from outside of Toronto to remove, that's like a class war. Like what we're dealing with it's scary to me. Mm-hmm. And I bike past, Trinity Bellwoods every day, and I was like, what the fuck? So that worries me. Like, why aren't we putting the resource to make sure people have, and I know that it's trickier than that, but it's building trust with folks on the ground. I think it's really important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll go to our last question of the evening, unless any others pop up. This is from Zoe Alexis Abrams. Can we make an application on behalf of another venue that became a makeshift concert space? The Owls Club, for example, became an accessible place to play when the other venues shut down. The owners and staff supported us and have their own precarities. I know a lot of us would love to continue to support them because it's such a vibrant historical community. So I think that points to like the makeshiftness of, spaces in the city and the creativity that people put, because the Owls Club was kind of a, diamond in the rough, and people found it and realized that it was the infrastructure we needed, and it happened to have a staff that was supported. And I know that I went to vote in the Portuguese hall near my house, and I was like, this is a sweet venue. and there's so many of those halls around. So maybe this is for Alok, but like, the relationship between more of these makeshift spaces or temporary venue spaces. Is there any thinking about those?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what they mean by application in terms of making an application to make it a permanent business. That's something that they would certainly, they can apply for a business permit within the city, but it would something that they would need to work with the owner of the property on whether it can be maintained. So. Yeah, I'm not sure I can give much more than that at this point.
It sounds like maybe the work outside the core would support, uses in spaces like that, like these kinds of clubs. And
Yeah, no, I think, one of the great things about the emerging entertainment area report is it really put a spotlight on how many potential areas there are outside of the core that could be utilized for either venue operation or other businesses, and that are actually zoned for that. That's the challenge, right? There's areas within the downtown core that are zoned, but it's not going to expand for obvious reasons. There's so much to butt up against residential and blah blah blah. But there are areas outside of the core that are zoned, and it may be just a matter of us not being able to promote that in the past. But now that we know that it exists, I think it's going to be really important for us to put a spotlight on that, to say, hey, if you're willing to go out of the core, there are these areas that are there that can be utilized. And again, through the emerging entertainment as well, the code review that Toronto Buildings and Fire are planning on doing, it'll be really interesting to see within the context of what the city can do, whether that could allow and open up space for temporary use and multi-use. Because so much of it relies on what the province states as the rules and regs around building code. But through this process, we'll be able to see if within the levers and powers of the city, can we actually start using space as a multi-use space. So as an example, it could be a daycare during the day and a club at night, as an example. So where it'll take some time to get that information and to see if it's possible, but that's certainly something we're looking into.
Yeah. Sara, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say, in case I'm not sure, but in case the question had to do with, applying for heritage designation, yeah, it can be anyone. So it doesn't have to be the venue itself, right? In fact, that can be terrifying for somebody who doesn't want to have their space be designated, because it can bring in, certain obligations that, or expenses to protecting the building. No, but anyone can actually apply to have something heritage designated. It doesn't have to be the owner, the operator. It can be an adjacent group. It could be anyone. It just, you have to craft the thing. But
yeah, I think the contrast of the conversation we just were having and this just represents that this is a very big conversation, from technical building code to who we are as people. And I think it harkens back to what I was saying about this conversation needing to be pushed on all levels at all times. So really grateful to host this conversation. Is there any final thoughts from panelists?
I always have a final thought. Again, I mean, it's not just, me hating on the city, it's hating on our system. Like, we're also let's cut the police budget in half and let's give that towards the arts. We have Black and brown bodies, queer and trans folks, who are terrified of walking around in our city, strictly because of the police. So this is where culturally and politically, we all need to, challenge these things, because it just feels like we're doing land acknowledgements. We're finally acknowledging Indigenous sovereignties to a certain extent, but we're still acknowledging colonial rule in a way. And I'm not saying I know it's just not get rid of one or the other. It's going to take time, but these are things that I think that it's very difficult for artists like myself and the community around us. We have difficulty with, because often the city or governmental policies don't impact us in a positive way. And even if you're like an immigrant or if you're non-status, it's very difficult in the city. It's getting better, but it's scary. So that's my last thoughts.
And we do have one more question. And I think this is an interesting question because it brings in these kind of broad ideas of care and who we are, and more, these steps we can take. And it's for Alok, from Jeremy Forsyth. Speaking to the idea of cultural spaces as care, is there potential for economic development culture to collaborate with Toronto Housing or even Parks Department to create cultural community spaces that actively practice care in the necessary and holistic ways that artists need?
Absolutely. There's definitely potential. And one good thing about, say, the night economy internal working group, and actually even during COVID, one of the things that it did break down was barriers or silos within the city. So you now have people where the entire city has a common goal, and that's really to not only look at recovery, meaning returning to the past, but look at renewal. So there's a lot of opportunities here for us to co-collaborate, to do the things that we may have wanted to do, but because of the traditional way of doing things, we could not do. And so I've seen the city itself grow. And so with that growth, there's been a lot of amazing work being done amongst different divisions. And so this is something certainly that is possible. I know that we do have a representation of folks on the internal working group for the night economy, but that's something we can certainly look into, and I think it should be a priority as we come out of the pandemic and move more towards an endemic.
But as you do that, make sure you invite the folks who actually practice care, because right now it is being co-opted, these words, and there is such a difference between really having your empathy really in all around you versus just using the words. And Toronto is very good at talking shit, but doing it's a different thing. So that's, Alok, just make sure you invite people who understand what that looks like and also can work with you, because like I've just seen too many people use that language and really don't give a fuck. But because of who they are, they get let in. And it breaks my heart because it's just another tool that people are using to sort of make them get up in a capitalist society versus actually the intention of real care. But I love you as my brother.
We got a history.
Love you too, Rose.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. This was such a rich conversation, and I know that it's going to be shared on the YouTube as a artifact of where we're at and the steps that we need to take. So I really thank you all for your energy, spirits, contributions to this. Johnny, do you want to do the outro? Are you there? If not, I'll do it. So anyways, again, thanks to all the panelists, and please follow Wavelength on the socials at Wavelength Music, and be sure to mark February 18th to 26th, 2022 on your calendars for their upcoming Winter Fest. Thank you, everyone. Have a sweet evening.
Thanks.
Take care.
Take care.